Hi, it's Denise, and today I wanted to talk about something a little different. I wanted to talk about, in this time where we're having so much tension regarding discrimination of so many different kinds, racial, gender, sexuality, uh, place of origin, ethnicity, religion, you name it. We're having so many problems in our country right now with both very real discrimination and also perceived discrimination. And I just wanted to take a look at sort of, if you look at, I don't want to say the history of discrimination so much as, because a lot of people have been talking about that lately, particularly as it pertains to racism and the United States history with slavery. I think a lot of people are talking about that. I wanted to talk more about problems that people with disabilities, whether they're physical or psychological or psychiatric or we've reached a point in our social awareness where I think most decent people are trying not to offend. And sometimes political correctness can get in the way of a conversation. And at the same time, it's important that we're sensitive to not using words that are hurtful or offensive. And I think finding that balance can sometimes be difficult. Like, I'm trying to approach this topic in a way of being inclusive and supportive, and yet I know someone will be offended by something I say or a word that I choose to use. Because there are people who live to be offended. I know my brother married one. You don't even realize you've done anything wrong, and she's, you're dead to her because you've slighted her in some way. And she doesn't even have anything really to be sensitive about. But, you thanked her for something in person, but you didn't follow up with a thank you card. That's it, you're dead to her, Because, like I said, some people just live to be offended, to find fault in what other people are doing or saying. So I realize those people are out there, but I'm hoping that most of us are trying not to be that person, especially in our current times, our current situation with what's going on in the country. Forgive my hair. I just took a bath and washed it, and it is still wet, and it is kind of doing its own thing. Okay, back to, I look matronly in this. I got this sweater dress, and honestly, I thought, when I'm standing up, believe it or not, it is somewhat flattering, but sitting down, yeah, I'm looking kind of matronly. Not digging the look. Anyway, we won't talk about that. Isn't my necklace nice? Anyway, back to what we're talking about. I started my career as a nurse back in the late 1980s. And most of my 26-year career was spent in some area of mental health. That encompasses a whole lot of things. It encompasses psychiatric illness. It encompasses addiction or substance abuse or chemical dependency. And again, now we're going back to the 1980s, and I'm going to talk about historically times way before that, where the terminology that was appropriate then is not the appropriate terminology now. Alexa, stop. But she's been doing that lately. I forget that I have a timer set, and I start a video, and then I have to yell at my Alexa. I said her name, she lit up again. Okay, we're So, in the 1980s, the part of the government, the part of the Department of Health in New York State that oversaw the care of people with cognitive development type disabilities, was referred to as OMRDD, which stood for the Office of Mental Retardation and Developmental Disabilities. Now, obviously, we don't use the term mental retardation or mentally retarded anymore. It is seen as a slur. Back in the day, it was purely seen as a medical diagnosis. Like I was saying about going further back in history, the terms like idiot and moron and lunatic and hysteric were medical diagnoses, which became used by laymen as slurs and were then replaced with words like mental retardation, developmentally disabled. Hysterics basically became neurotic, which then became recognized as anxiety disorders. Lunatics became often recognized as what we might now call someone with a mood disorder, possibly a bipolar disorder, possibly a thought disorder such as schizophrenia. But as a medical diagnosis, medical word starts being thrown around by laymen as a slur, it then gets replaced with a new term. So back in the day, in the 1980s, when I was working, the office was called OMRDD, like I said. And for psychiatric issues, because they were two separate facilities, treated separate things. Office of Mental Health was if you had a psychiatric problem. OMRDD, Office of Mental Retardation and Developmental Disabilities, try saying that one 3 times fast, was for if you had WOS. Fell under that category. And basically, if you were someone who worked at and was looking to find a place to get services for a disabled individual, you had to look at when were they diagnosed. Generally, it became very hard to prove a diagnosis of developmental disability if it wasn't picked up on before the age of 16. That was how the regulations were written. If someone hadn't figured out and documented by the time you were 16 years old that you had cognitive limitations, then later on, you couldn't say you had them, which seems kind of ridiculous, but, and I'm just touching the mouse here or else my screen's going to go to sleep. And the lights will dim. I should probably move the mouse so it doesn't have to be so obvious every time I do that. So, I worked in both kinds of places. I worked at a psychiatric hospital, a state-run psychiatric hospital, which fell under the Office of Mental Health. And I also worked at private facilities, including residential, camping, day treatment, and sheltered workshops for people with developmental disabilities. So I worked under OMH facilities and also OMRDD facilities. So the regulations varied between the two different types of facilities, and they were put in place largely in response to prior abuses of these vulnerable populations of people. Now, obviously, these populations of people still exist. We may use different terms. In fact, ICFs, that stands for Intermediate Care Facility. They stopped making new ICFs back when I was still working in ICFs. They had switched over to people that, an ICF was for people who needed a higher level of care than people who were in a community residence, which was another specific term, which designated the level of care and supervision that the person there needed under OMRDD guidelines. And they stopped creating new ICFs and were looking at that time to find more community residence-based settings for people who were currently residing in ICFs. Now, again, different setting, different regulations. There was also, we're going back now, to the late 60s, early 70s, when the atrocities at the institution known as Willowbrook were discovered and uncovered by Geraldo Rivera, who now some people kind of take very lightly, but back then he was a very serious journalist who uncovered, like I said, true atrocities in terms of the care of the people, if you can't even call it care, of the mistreatment of the people at the Willowbrook facility. Essentially, he scheduled a visit, and then he showed up a day early and insisted upon, basically pushed his way in, so that he'd see the true conditions, because he had gotten tips that the place always put on a good face when there was an inspection of any kind or any sort of publicity, might be occurring, but that the day-to-day running was very different. And it was extremely true that, you can look up, there are documentaries on Willowbrook if you want to learn more about it, but it's disturbing. I will tell you, if you watch the full documentaries, it is disturbing. I did watch them as part of my being trained to work at a privately owned, non-profit organization for people with developmental disabilities. It was an organization that was originally founded by parents of disabled children. So the name of it was AHRC, Association for the Help of Retarded Children. Now, again, we don't use the term retarded anymore, but this was founded back in the day, back in the 60s, by a small group of parents. At the time, that was the medically correct term, and so it was in no way meant to be offensive. And the governing board of the agency always consists of parents. During the whole time I worked for them, and I worked with them over a period of about 10 years. And basically in the 1990s, I worked with AHRC. And that's where I worked both. Again, I said both when I mean more than two. I worked at their summer camps. At summer camp, you called the people there campers. I could run into that same person at one of their ICFs or community residences, and there I would call them a resident. And if I saw them at a sheltered workshop or day treatment program, they would be a program participant. Then at one point, the agency decided we had to call everyone consumers. Now, to me, the word consumer just was wrong. To me, like, you say consumer, and my mind goes to a picture of like a big fish consuming a smaller fish. That's not what they were going for. They felt like consumer was an equalizing term because they said if someone goes to seek professional services, say from an accountant or a lawyer or a doctor, you are a consumer of their services. And why should people with developmental disabilities, because they are utilizing the services of a residential facility or a summer camp or a sheltered workshop, why should they be any different? So we're going to call them all consumers. That one didn't stick, really, at least not during the time that I was there. And personally, I think most people found it a little strange. A lot of people just used the word client because they felt like client was a more inclusive word. I've never referred to myself as a consumer unless I'm talking about like purchasing goods or eating something. If I was talking about going to a lawyer or a doctor, I would refer to myself as a client or a patient. But they wanted a one fits all term that you could use that would not be considered discriminatory or imply what the person's, I guess even imply that the person had a disability, which was just sort of awkward. That's when you've reached the point that trying to be socially and politically correct is now becoming just awkward. and you're having to come up with whole long sentences to replace simple words or phrases that are now, taboo to use. Anyway, these facilities themselves evolved as it became recognized that perhaps people could be afforded more comfort and more freedom in less restrictive settings. Now, always the idea was to have someone live in the least restrictive setting that they needed, and periodically they would be reviewed. They had an individualized treatment plan, and again, facilities ranged from really good, where you'd be happy that your family member or other loved one was residing because they were well taken care of. They were offered a stimulating, interesting environment that had a, cozy family home-like feel to it, to others that felt very cold and institutional, and the care was not particularly friendly or personal. And, if you were fortunate enough to get into one of the better ones, it was a really good thing, because there were, unfortunately, and hopefully today it's gotten better. Again, I'm talking back, this was mostly in the 1980s and 90s, and there were quite a few that were not very good. Now, AHRC, being a parent-run organization, their houses were good, and they had long waiting lists to get into. Unfortunately, though, human beings are human beings, and the care that people got could vary from day to day, not because the policy of the institution changes, but because the individual staff members working. Some are just better than others. Some are more caring, nicer, better people than others. And if you've ever been a patient in a hospital, I certainly have on many occasions, you can have nurses who are really caring and compassionate, and you can have nurses who are really miserable, and you feel like, wow, you should be working in a different profession. And that's coming from a nurse. I worked with plenty of nurses who were great, who gave 110% of themselves, and I also worked with a good number of nurses who shouldn't have even been working with people because they were miserable bitches. And I apply that word to both men and women. You don't have to be a woman to be a miserable bitch, in my book. Anyway, things have progressed, hopefully gotten better, but again, from, early history when there was really no medical treatment, people were, then started performing lobotomies, which were horrible. In the 1980s and 90s, I was still taking care of older patients who had been lobotomized in the 1950s. And their emotional range was very, very abnormal. I remember being present when a woman in her 60s was told that her last living relative, her mother, had passed away. The psychiatrist, who was the, sort of head of the care team on our unit, he and I went to break the news to her that we had received word that her mother had passed away. And we were ready to be supportive, that she was receiving this very devastating, to most people, news. And she basically said, "Oh, okay, can I have a cigarette?" And that was it. And that wasn't because she was an uncaring person. It was because she had been lobotomized when she was a teenager. The invention of Thorazine and other early antipsychotic medications, and also growing public awareness of what lobotomies did, helped to stop the use of lobotomies. Unfortunately, there became overuse of antipsychotic medications to treat non-psychotic conditions because they also had a heavy sedative effect. Unfortunately, they also had a heavy profile of side effects, including long-term neurological damage that was irreversible. Even once the person came off, they would have abnormal involuntary movements, a condition known as tardive dyskinesia, which can look like the genetic condition Huntington's chorea. If you're familiar with that, it's not a very common condition, but it involves involuntary movements, like very noticeable full body involuntary movements, or sometimes more subtle, like facial tics or grimacing. But it can be progressive. In Huntington's chorea, it is progressive, but when it's caused by the use of psychiatric medications, it can be progressive, or it can kind of get to a certain point and just stay at that point. While the person's on medications, if they're just having an acute reaction, there are medications that counteract that. But it doesn't change the fact that you might be causing these long-term problems. So that was a problem with the early antipsychotics. Yes, they were much better than lobotomizing people, but were they overused? Yes, and even when used properly, they could cause these really bad long-term side effects. We've come a long way since then. We've developed newer drugs with lower side effect profiles, and of course there are still people who their condition does not respond to medication, regardless of the number of medications and combinations that are tried. Those people will always need supportive care, often in a residential setting, especially if their family is not able to care for them, if their parents are getting too old to care for them, if there is no family left to care for them. So hopefully we've emerged as a society in terms of taking care of people with disabilities. Now, onto the also touchy and cringy subjects of talking about race or ethnicity or even just skin color without talking about where you come from. Many of us have had that cringy experience. I know my own son had it. He said my mother used the term chinky, describing a doll's eyes, and my son, who is 17, inwardly cringed at her use of this racial slur. Now, my mother, who is in her late 70s, did not feel like she was being offensive, referring to the doll's almond-shaped eyes as chinky. Now, did you just cringe along with me? You probably did. My son certainly did when he heard her use the word. Now, I know my mother has nothing against people of Asian descent. I'm sure she didn't mean to sound racist when she said that in front of my son. But that doesn't make it okay to use that word now. I had a similar experience when I was young. My late grandfather, at this point, very late grandfather, he was born in 1909. When I was a kid, I remember him he wasn't speaking to the person, but he was recounting to me a conversation that he had had with someone many, many years prior, and he used the word Negro, and I internally cringed, because by that time, we were using the word black. And some people weren't okay with black. We weren't really using African American yet. Some people were kind of using person of color. It was like that in between, what word as a white person can I use without being offensive? Because I'm not meaning to be offensive. The same thing, my grandfather was way ahead of his time, I would say, in terms of inclusiveness and open-mindedness. My grandfather loved, and I mean loved, all kinds of people, all skin tones, all ethnic backgrounds, all religions, all national origins. He was definitely, I would say, ahead of his generation in terms of not being racist. In his time, when he was a young man, the term Negro was appropriate. We wouldn't use that term now. But again, like you can relate, I think, to that inner cringe when you hear someone use a term that's not appropriate now, even though they might be older or come from a setting where that word wasn't considered so offensive. I mean, even just from country to country. For example, in Britain, people throw the C word, as we often in America refer to it, around like it's no big deal. They would use it as lightly as we might use the word bitch. Oh, you're being such a bitch. Do we really mean offense? No. But if you call me the C word, I'm going to take offense. Yet, I have friends from England who throw around the C word very casually, and no real offense is meant. Here, we take that as much more offensive to women. And we do not throw that word around as lightly. That's just a cultural difference, and I've learned that if it's someone from a different part of the world and they're using it, that they may not mean it in the way that I was raised, that word is incredibly offensive. Because in their culture, it's not incredibly offensive any more than I would take terrible offense to the word, oh, stop being a bitch, Denise. Hey, if I'm being a bitch and you just called me out on it, am I going to get offended? Probably not. If I'm in a really bitchy mood, I might still be mad at you, but I'm not going to be mad at you for calling me a bitch if I'm being a bitch. That's a word that I don't have a problem with. Some people do have a problem with it. Then we get back to like I was saying with skin color. Let's not even talk about your ethnic background or where you were born, because the term African American gets thrown around as meaning the same thing as black. And there are people whose skin is black, who identify as black, and they're not from Africa. They're maybe from Haiti or Jamaica or somewhere else that is not Africa. They might be from India and they identify as black, simply because they have a darker skin tone. And in their culture, that is how they identify. I, as a clearly white person, and not just white, I am on the pale spectrum of white. If you're going from like vampire ghostly white to really, like ebony skinned, dark complexion black, I'm pretty far to the end of the white spectrum in terms of, like, let's use like makeup colors. If I'm looking for, foundation or concealer, I generally have to go for the lightest or second to lightest color that is offered. It's usually called ivory something. If we were talking paint, I would be like eggshell, just that barely off-white color. I look at skin tone sort of like that. I don't really necessarily equate skin tone with where your national ethnic background is, what your cultural identity is. And, like in the past, the idea of referring to, as we now comfortably see people, politicians, regular folk, we can use the terms black communities, brown communities, indigenous communities, communities of color. None of these are considered slurs. 20 years from now, people might get that internal cringe if they hear one of us use one of those terms. Who knows? My point is, we have to, while being sensitive to what is the current correct term, we also have to be careful of reading the person's intention. Let's not jump on someone because they accidentally said African American when the person they're talking about is black but not African. Or chooses not to identify as African American, they choose to identify as Black. If the person who called them African American said so with no malice in their heart and no affront intended, maybe we can gently point out, oh, I would prefer if you referred to me as whatever it is you prefer to be identified as. Same with gender or sexual orientation if it comes up and you're being identified by someone. If they choose the wrong term, if they don't mean offense, maybe take it as a gentle teaching moment to say, I realize you didn't mean any offense, but personally, I prefer to be called, maybe you don't like gay, maybe you identify as queer, maybe you identify as non-binary, maybe, whatever it is. You just don't jump on the person, give them the benefit of the doubt. I mean, if they're obviously being a dick, then by all means jump on them. But if they're not, and they just used the wrong word because they didn't know, either that it's become outdated or that it's not the word you personally prefer, or it's not the word that applies to you because they just don't know you that well, take it as a teaching moment. That's what I'm trying to get people to have that mindset. Because right now, with the amount of tension out there, let's really only treat the haters as haters and not treat those who accidentally use a wrong term or phrase or definition or way of referring to you or your group that you identify with. Let's not throw the people who do it accidentally in with the people who are doing it intentionally. Because with tension as high as it is, an accident, a slip of the tongue, the use of the wrong word when no offense was intended, can turn into an argument and then a fight and then a full-blown, brawl. And we have enough brawling going on with the real haters out there causing it. We have to be careful that we're not letting accidents and misunderstandings come between those of us who are on the same side, the side of inclusion, the side of cohesiveness as a nation and as a people. I hope if you're interested in this, you will do some research into the history of different groups. Again, whether that is gender, ethnicity, sexuality, race, and see historically what these groups have faced in terms of challenges so that you can understand why they might be sensitive to certain words. And it will help you, to not use the wrong words, but also to realize when you do owe someone an apology. I'm sorry can go a long way. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that word was offensive. Let's take the word Oriental. I've heard people say it's very offensive. I've heard someone who was described as Oriental say, I asked her, after the person who described her that way walked away, I said, hey, I've heard that term is offensive. Were you offended by what she just said to you? And she said, no, I don't find that offensive. I use that term. Now, she was Filipino, the person who said that she was okay with the term Oriental. And other people have very strong opinions that Oriental is an outdated and racist term. It's a very individual thing for some people. So you can totally, with no bad intention, offend someone. And if you find yourself offended, now, I consider myself American. I am, on my mother's side, 6th generation American, On my father's side, I am a second-generation American. I consider myself American. I did the Ancestry DNA thing. I'm 96% Irish-Scottish because they can't really make that definition. I know it's most likely all Irish, with my father's parents both having immigrated from Ireland, and my mother's people being primarily from Ireland. So, yeah, 96% Irish-Scottish I came up. One could say I would identify as Irish-American. Do I feel the need to make that distinction? No, I don't. I consider myself American. And I know I, many a year, pissed off elementary school teachers because I taught my children to identify. When they were asked what their nationality is, they're American. And, you know, like in 5th, 6th, 7th grade, somewhere in that area, you always get that, hey, write an essay on your ethnicity, or we're going to have ethnicity lunch day, and, you know, bring in a dish that represents your ethnicity. And I think people expected my kids with their Irish last names to bring in something Irish. Nope. They would bring in something that was considered American because we identify as American. And that's not to say that I'm not proud of my Irish heritage. I am. I would love to visit Ireland someday when there's not a global pandemic, and when my country isn't the epicenter of it, and when hopefully Ireland would be happy to have me visit. My father had dual citizenship. He had an American passport and an Irish passport. If he was doing business in Europe, he said you got around much faster because you got to wait in the shorter lines using the Irish passport. My father is deceased. You may have heard me mention if you've seen any of my other videos, you may have heard me mention my father passed away at the beginning of this year. But he had dual citizenship because both of his parents were Irish citizens who came to the United States in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and he was actually born in 1941 here, so they came actually, I think, in like 38, 39. They did not come together. They met in New York. They immigrated separately from different parts of Ireland, and they met in New York. But they were both Irish citizens who became American citizens. And my father was a first-generation American. But because of that, he was entitled to Irish citizenship as well, and proudly had his dual citizenship. And like I said, with my 96% DNA results, hey, I think I should qualify as well. I know the laws don't work that way. They go by the if your parents were both citizens. And like I said, I identify as American, proud of my Irish heritage, and would love to visit, but I am American, as are my children. And I don't feel the need to be anything American. And I feel like as a country, it doesn't mean you're giving up your traditions or your pride in your background or where your people came from. It just means you recognize that we are a country. We don't have to be a hyphen something American. If we stick together as Americans, we will make this country better for all of us, because you don't have to just be an African American or an Italian American or a Cuban American. When all of us just truly consider all of us to be Americans, we'll all be treated more equally. I believe that. I think making the distinction as a point of pride, I understand. But when you use it as an identifier, you're using it in an exclusionary way. You're saying, I'm part of this subset. I'm not part of the general set of being an American. And I know some people will take offense. And again, I'm not saying don't be proud of your heritage and your background and your culture. Celebrate it. Celebrate your holidays. Celebrate your religion. Celebrate your cultural traditions, your foods, your, way of dress, your whatever it is to you about your culture that you love. Embrace that, celebrate it. But don't think that it means you have to be not just American. We are one of the only countries where we feel the need to justify ourselves with some sort of hyphen. And I think that keeps the separation and segregation alive. Now, again, that is just my personal opinion. And I realize that a lot of people, again, as a point of pride, like to identify as a something American, be it Native American, African American. Like I said, I could be an Irish American. But first and foremost, I'm an American. And all my fellow Americans, that's how I see you. Regardless of your religion, your gender, your skin color, your sexual preference, your... See, I use the word preference. I probably pissed someone off. Your sexual orientation. Because people will say preference implies choice. Not implying that your sexuality is a choice. It's not. It's who you were born as. Just as your gender identity, I believe. I'm not one of those people who says, oh, you're just choosing that. I think that is so ignorant and narrow-minded. No, it's not a choice. Being transgender is not a choice. I see all of you as my fellow Americans. And I think we really need to be cohesive. I think we need to have an open dialogue where we include each other and not try to break down into subgroups if we truly want to be the United States of America. I hope you found this interesting and thought-provoking. Again, I'm sure I probably, without intending to, may have offended some people, and if I did offend, I apologize, because genuinely my intention was not to offend. It was to open a dialogue where we look at where we're going wrong as a society and how we deal with this incredible tension that is causing the violence that we're seeing. I am all for peaceful protests, and it is abhorrent that our federal government is attacking peaceful protesters in a violent manner that goes against our constitutional rights as Americans. All Americans have the constitutional right to peaceful protest. So please give this video a thumbs up if you found it thought-provoking, even if you don't necessarily agree with all of my my opinions or personal beliefs, because I respect your right to have your own opinions and personal beliefs. And that's part of the conversation we all need to have. We can agree to disagree respectfully. Now, of course, white supremacists can't seem to do that. That's who when I talk about the real haters, that's the kind of groups I'm talking about. And we have them in all groups. The white supremacists are the most obvious and the ones that it's most politically okay to talk about. But we have black hate groups. Just like we have hate groups against Muslims, we have Muslims who hate non-Muslims. It's just, as a white person, I have to be very careful because I am seen as the ultimate potential racist. And if I even mention that there's racism against white people, then is she racist? Something else to think about. How, as a white woman, as a straight white woman, I have to be very careful not to offend accidentally, because, the only thing that could be worse is if I was male. Because then I would be that straight white man who is the, what everyone looks at as the potential biggest bigot, racist, narrow-minded person. And that's not a fair thing to assume. We should never make assumptions, just like it's not right to make assumptions because someone is black, brown, indigenous, Asian, gay, straight. It's not okay to make assumptions because someone is white. So let's all try to be open to seeing the goodness in each other and recognizing the real haters when we encounter them. Sometimes we can't educate them the same way we can those who just don't know better or just are misinformed or, like I said, just maybe don't have friends in a certain group and therefore aren't up to date with the correct terms. They're not intending offense. I would step in if I saw someone being bullied. Even if I don't know the correct word for what they're being bullied for. If my mind clearly sees it as, whoa, that group of people is bullying that individual who is different in some way, I've got a big mouth, and I have used it. And I have stepped up into the face of people to defend someone that I don't know. If that person then takes offense because I accidentally used the wrong word, that would hurt my feelings. Because I just jeopardized my personal safety to stand up for yours. Both your physical safety and also for your right to be you. So don't be angry at me for accidentally using the wrong word. Let's focus on recognizing hate from accidental ignorance and educating those who want to be educated. And that includes ourselves. And let's be inclusive as we move forward to try to help break this tension and to truly be the United States of America that we should be. Again, I rambled 10 minutes after I was saying thank you and like this video, which I usually say just at the end. But again, even if you didn't agree with everything, please like this video and consider sharing it, as I think we need to open the conversation. I think we need to be comfortable having these conversations that have become uncomfortable because of the tension. So like, subscribe, and talk to people you know who maybe could use a little gentle education. And like I said, if it's a topic that interests you or motivates you, do research yourself into the areas that you need to know more about or feel that you don't know enough about. And I try to do that myself. I try to research and stay up to date. Do I make mistakes? Yes, because guess what? Even before I'm American, I'm human, so I'm going to make mistakes. But have a great day, and in peace, love, and solidarity, I wish us all well in this time of ongoing crisis. Take care.